Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for so many of you for turning up. As David said, we did a dry run on this yesterday, and I've chopped a little bit out to make it just a little bit more spacey. It's around 50 minutes. I have to say that's a bit of a constraint because if you remember there's a guy called Raul Castro who used to do 10-hour speeches for Fidel. Well, I could do 10 hours on this subject at a pinch, but I have edited it right the way down. And the question I posed in the blurb that went out in advance was, how was it that the Germans got themselves into such a strategic corner at the end of, in the summer of 1914, that when faced with a crisis about Russia, Austria and the Balkans, their only option was to attack via a neutral country, France. It's a bit of a plot spoiler, but the answer is because they wanted to be boxed in. But that's what we're going to look at over the next 50 minutes. On the screen in front of you are three of the three men we're mainly talking about. That's the elder von Moltke, Schlieffen, and the younger von Moltke. Waldersee doesn't really interest us. He was only in power for 2 years. He then fell out big time with the Kaiser. Schlieffen was actually his second in command, who was there to do all the grunt work and all the detail, while Waldersee was doing the court politics. When Waldersee was sacked, Schlieffen was upgraded, even though his main métier, if you like, was the detail. Like, unfortunately, a lot of good ops people, he fancied himself as a strategist, when in fact he was the master of tunnel vision. So we're going to look at these three gentlemen in particular, and we're taking the story up to the start of the war. Before we get too much underway, I think a little bit on terminology. When people use the expression Schlieffen Plan, it tends to cover many things. It's used to describe the plan that Germany launched in 1914, which is not true. That wasn't a Schlieffen Plan. The strict definition of the Schlieffen Plan is this thing, the Great Memorandum, which Schlieffen wrote in early 1906. It was then backdated to 1905 to have the imprimatur of when he was in office. It usually says in most books that it was written in 1905, but it wasn't. But it is agreed by pretty well everybody that it was the basis for German strategy in 1914. But as times change, events change, and the situation was different by 1914, you've got to kind of understand what was the essence of Schlieffen, what was at the heart of it, even if circumstances changed. And these are the four things I would single out. Firstly, in keeping with most of his fellow members of the officer class of the German army, war was just a policy option. It wasn't something to regret having to use, which is how Clausewitz saw it, where, you know, politics, a war was the extension of politics by other means. It was actually a statement of failure. For Schlieffen, it was just a thing to do. One of his colleagues said at one point, only weapons can arbitrate between serious disputes between nations. So for them, if you wanted something to be achieved and it needed war, then war was the thing you did. And after all, they'd fought 3 of them in the 60s and 70s, won the lot and got what they wanted. So you can kind of understand why they thought that. Secondly, and thirdly and fourthly, the 3 things we most associate Schlieffen with: an invasion of neutral territory, using a right-wing envelopment to seek a battle of annihilation. But you might ask, surely central to Schlieffen was a 2-front war, that the whole point of the thing was that he fought first in France and then turned his forces on Russia. Well, not strictly true. The actual document, the Great Memorandum, is actually for just a 1-front war. It is only about an attack on France. Surely central to the Schlieffen Plan is the route around Paris. Well, yes, it was. Paris was pretty important, but it wasn't a non-negotiable. It was only if actually it was only a worst case scenario, and there were other scenarios where the German army turned inwards. The key variable is where were the French, and it is the change in strategy of the French that changes why the Schlieffen Plan had to be changed between its writing in 1906 and when it was sort of used, which was 1914. Before we get underway, we have to do the historiographical bit. Here's Hermann von Kuhl, who we come across more than once in this story. We didn't know about the Schlieffen Plan during the war. It only emerged as a thing during the 1920s. Predominantly, we got it from generals like von Kuhl, who needed to explain to the German people how 44 years of war planning had all gone belly up. And their explanation was a three-part explanation that you still hear to this day. Schlieffen had a plan, Moltke messed with it, and then badly mismanaged in 1914. This three-part story. And it emerges in some very authoritative books by very well-known historians still today. This three-part explanation. The last part, that he mismanaged it in 1914, is undoubtedly true. The other two parts of the story are what we're going to discuss this evening. The established story put out by the German generals was challenged first by a chap called Gerhard Ritter in 1958. He exposed the flaws in the Schlieffen Plan, in particular that he used more troops than he actually had at the time, or indeed von Moltke had in 1914. There it kind of lay as a bit of a sort of awkward question until 1999-2000, when Terence Zuber brought out this book, Inventing the Schlieffen Plan. Zuber had a sort of controversial argument that the Schlieffen Plan was actually a myth, that the Great Memorandum was completely at odds with all other German war planning, and it was invented after the war as the thing that would have won the war, so as to justify why the war was lost, and in turn blame it on Moltke and two other chaps who were both conveniently dead. The advantage of Zuber's book wasn't his argument, it was that the real experts, Robert Foley, Terence Holmes and Annika Mombauer, gradually over the next 4 or 5 years debunked Zuber and brought out what is, if you like, the established story of the Schlieffen Plan, and that's what you're mainly going to hear tonight. Our problem is that this slide used to have a picture of a Lancaster bomber on it, and the reason for that is that in early 1945, a raid on Berlin blew up the German archives. So we do not have the full picture of the Schlieffen Plan. We do not have a copy of the document in full. If it's anywhere, it's somewhere in the Soviet archives. Ritter used resources that came from a bit of the archives that weren't bombed and turned up in America in the 50s. Zuber used stuff that we didn't even know existed until the Russians released it when Gorbachev was in power. So even today, and we'll never see stuff from Russia again, I don't suppose, while Putin's in power, we have a very incomplete picture of this story. Even some of the best sources are actually secondary. We start with the strategic landscape for the period from the unification of Germany in 1871 to Schlieffen leaving office at the end of 1905. The point was that as soon as they defeated France in 1871, the German General Staff started planning for a two-front war. If you look at a map of Europe, it's really the only thing that needs to worry them, particularly once Austria-Hungary had been tied into a deal, into the dual alliance in 1879. There is no other combination of powers that threatens Germany, and no single power could remotely threaten Germany. So the planners were always thinking about this particular combination. Von Moltke actually did his first, the elder von Moltke did his first plan for this as early as 1860. So the Franco-Russian Pact, when it rocks along in the early 1890s, actually just confirmed something they always knew, and isn't anywhere near as historical important a thing as it's sometimes portrayed. It was always the only thing that worried them. Schlieffen, oddly enough, did not like the pact with Austria-Hungary. He thought it was a bad deal. He would have much rather have had some kind of agreement with Russia. Making an enemy out of Russia, he thought was a very bad thing. In this case, he was absolutely right. This situation of fearing two powers lasted until 1903 to 1905, when briefly Russia disappears from the equation. First of all, there's the Russo-Japanese War. Then Russia collapses into the chaos of the First Revolution. The point about Russia in 1903, 1904 initially was that what attracted Schlieffen to it was that it wasn't just that resources were taken over to the east, it was that the Russians fought spectacularly badly, and that made him realize that they were unlikely to come in. So what we're going to do now is look at the three strategic options that the Germans developed for the years 1871 through to 1905. Well, option one was to rerun the Franco-Prussian War. And this was the strategy that von Moltke used up until 1879. Act on the defensive in the east and attack across the short shared border in the west. In 1871, the French, or 1870, sorry, the French had come down the Moselle Valley, cut the French in half, and then taken out the two halves of the French army in separate engagements at Metz and at Sedan. But they had been held up thereafter, and this is often forgotten. They were then held up once they surrounded Paris all along the line of the Loire. And it took another year for them to finally put, well, best part of a year anyway, to finally defeat the French. This bit is often forgotten. All that's remembered is Sedan and Metz. But von Moltke realized that a victory in a war in the future would be a much tougher thing. That came to an end by 1879. France recovered much more quickly than the Germans expected. By 1874, they'd paid off their debts, but by 1879, they'd built this line of fortresses around Verdun and Epinal and Tours, which meant that as far as Moltke was concerned, the border was hermetically sealed. Now, before we move on to the second option, it is worth saying, although I've divided it into three clear, distinct blocks, actually, in reality, they often moved around and switched and modified them quite a bit. These are the three broad themes of the period. The next option then for Moltke was one that would have been very handy in 1914. And here you have to, and von Moltke the Elder is really the only admirable person in this story. You have to look at the way he came to this problem. His strategic evaluation was that Germany was, quite correctly he saw it, a satisfied power. They got all the land they wanted. They'd won 3 wars. All they needed to do was suppress the enemy, not destroy it. Because of this French resistance south of the Loire, he had very little confidence the rapid war of annihilation was possible. So his strategy was to use the land that he'd acquired at his, which is what he wanted. He had acquired South Lorraine and Alsace, particularly for their defensive capabilities, to defend with 45% of the army in Alsace and Lorraine and 55% on the Eastern Front. He would defend this short shared border and then not generally attack, maybe draw the Russians into an attack and then defeat them tactically, probably somewhere around Warsaw. At that point, he would hand it over to Bismarck and say, cut us a deal. He was not looking for the complete destruction of the enemy. It was not a defensive strategy, which is what Schlieffen thought it could be described as. It was more like a defensive offensive strategy. Now we come on to Schlieffen and his kind of version of the problem, about how he tried to tackle the problem. So we need to look a little bit at how Schlieffen thought about the matter. The Schlieffen Plan is conservatism's last stand against the technological revolution that was taking place in firepower, smokeless weapons, bigger guns, machine guns. There was this revolution in firepower in the last half of the 19th century. Each one of those developments seemed to play to the defensive. And if you look at the few wars there were between 1871 and 1914, each of them had a lesson that seemed to indicate that the defensive was paramount. The Battle of Plevna in the Russo-Turkish War, the Turks, although distinctly inferior to the Russians, held up the Russians for days at Plevna. The Boer War, with the smaller Boer army holding back the British, particularly in the early stages. And the Russo-Japanese War, where although the Japanese won, it was the losses and the casualties through automated fire were considerable. All of this threatened the big thing that the Prussians thought they had as an advantage, their military discipline, the quality of their soldiers. It was no good having the best soldiers if the inferior soldiers could blast you out of the water with their firepower from a greater distance. What they failed to appreciate, that this was actually one of the reasons why they'd won in 1870. The German artillery was vastly superior to the French. Here are the list of some of the arguments that were going on within the German higher command about the impact of technology. Would you have mobile guns or heavy guns? Would the guns be located close to the infantry where they were vulnerable and part of the offensive, or farther back? Should infantry be in a closed order, which is how they'd won the battles in the 60s and 70s, or should they be in an open order? Schlieffen, this guy on the right, was the guy who favoured an open order infantry, and having written a paper was largely pushed to one side. Von der Goltz was a defence specialist who also was pushed to one side, as the Conservatives, by and large, won the argument. Their attitude to machine guns was interesting. Yes, they quite liked them, but then they looked at them and thought, yes, but they're a defensive weapon. They're no use in the offensive. The cart that carries them is twice the weight of the gun itself. So machine guns were pushed to the back. Schlieffen's obsession with envelopment was a way of getting round this problem of technology. He wanted to avoid a head-to-head battle. His argument was pretty straightforward, in line with pretty well every sort of higher command in Europe. They were all locked into, to a greater or lesser extent, a commitment to the offensive. By 1914, they all were. The French were the last to that particular party. For him, a strategy of exhaustion was impossible. His starting point was that he thought the modern society, as he saw it, non-agricultural society, urban society, would not be able to withstand a long battle. Society was already too interconnected to stand a long battle, and the casualties of a long battle engagement would be unsustainable. He'd have been astonished by what happened in the First World War. So his starting point was, I must have a short war of annihilation. He was looking at something to be all over in 6 to 9 months. And to achieve that, the flank attack and envelopment was the starting point and the end point. If he'd been stuck against one other soldier on a desert island, he would have sought a flank attack. And as I say, these ideas were reinforced by battles at Plevna, the Boer War, and in Manchuria. So, option 3, Schlieffen changes everything. Now it's just a small force in the east, and he is introducing this new element, a breach of Belgian neutrality. Schlieffen was not satisfied with the status quo. He differed sharply from von Moltke on this. He doesn't want to just defeat France. He wants to reduce France forever. He wants to remove the problem forever. If you look at what the Germans still wanted in early 1918 as war aims, they wanted all of Belgium. So this is an outright attempt to destroy a major power and upset the existing order. He also had some technical reasons for favouring this method. They'd done trials in 1896 of the German artillery and found that it wasn't strong enough to break through the fortress area on the border. He was also drawn to a fact that if you look at a map of Europe and you divide it into quadrants, it is the quadrant in the northwest, with Belgium at its centre, where railway density is its greatest. Belgium actually was the second country to industrialise after Britain. And it was that railway network, that ability to transport troops quickly, which drew Schlieffen to that part of the world. But he factors in the definite fact that Russia would be slow mobilising. So whereas Moltke was looking to fight 2 wars at the same time, Schlieffen is aiming to have 2 sequenced wars. He fights one, then he fights the other. And he attacks first in the West. It's actually possible that that was the Kaiser's idea. He seeks a war of annihilation, not a tactical victory. So there's no political dimension at all. It is a full marching order. Moltke's plan, as was Joffre's in 1914, was a plan of concentration. All it was a plan which got your troops into place to decide where to fight, and where you fought thereafter was decided in part by what the enemy was doing. Schlieffen had a marching order that dictated day by day where the army was. You can see the ops guy rather than the strategist coming out in that. And for the first time in a German strategic plan, you get the violation of a neutral country, Belgium. Nobody cared about Luxembourg. This idea actually had been floating around for quite a while. Bismarck had first touted it in 1887. Let's have a look at how it developed. The original plan was formulated he wrote his first document on this subject in 1897. Because the documentation is incomplete, it's not clear what year it actually became a formal plan. I suspect it was as late as 1900. We'll come on to why in a sec. He envisaged at that point that the decisive battle, would take place somewhere. It was more like a short-arm jab around the back of the French forts, because he realised even a man as politically insensitive as Schlieffen needed approval for going through neutral territory. He, at that point, went to see the politicians and said, look, this is what I'm planning. Their response in early 1900 is just kind of appallingly sycophantic. This is Baron von Holstein, who was the sort of equivalent of foreign secretary for Germany at the time. If the chief of the great general staff, and particularly a strategic authority like Schlieffen, thought that such a measure was necessary, then it would be the duty of diplomacy to adjust itself to it and prepare for it in every possible way. Effectively, the politicians were abrogating responsibility for diplomatic strategy to the soldiers. So this was his first attempt, and that's where it lay. He fell off his horse in 1902, and so was sort of out of action for a year. He was also toying with other options around 1902. everything changes in 1904, and there are a number of reasons for this. But the first one is that in the war games of that year, the right wing faltered around Mézières, which is about as far as it stretched. Meanwhile, over on the left, around Metz and around Strasbourg, they made a lot of progress. Now, you could have, I suppose, reinforced the left, but he didn't. He said, no, I'm going to take all that stuff from the left and I'm going to build the right wing. And we see in the next three plans, the 1905 and then the Great Memorandum, the right wing just gets stronger and stronger and stronger. The big thing that also changes the course of events is that by 1905, it's pretty clear that Russia would be in no state at all to join in a war with France. The weird thing about German strategy is it's not decided by themselves. The German strategy is based on what the French will do, and the French strategy is based on what the Russians will do. So there is this terrible sequence to it. So the Russians are going to remain neutral, in which case it's going to be a one-front war. If there's a one-front war and France is on her own, she is unlikely to attack. She is going to be on the defensive. She wouldn't be there at the outbreak of the war, but it is probable that, overpowered by the Germans, they would be forced back and would pin their left flank against the war against Paris. So because of that, Schlieffen starts building this right wing even bigger and bigger. It's all caused by the position of the French. So in 1905, in the actual war games, who cares about a neutrality? In 1905, he extends to the Netherlands. What he's seeking to do here is maneuver a large mass of troops and give them enough room to be able to come round and envelop a retreating French army. The Schlieffen Plan is not just a single, this is what we do document. It maps out a number of alternatives. And in the fourth iteration of the Great Memorandum, so right at the last minute, Schlieffen realizes that a likely option is that, given where the French will be, he will be forced to go around the back of Paris, but it is a contingent feature. So Schlieffen retires in 1905, and we'll come on to that a little bit later on. So can we unpack a little bit about the plan? There are various versions of these numbers you can find. They vary. These numbers are taken from Zuber's book. Now, Zuber comes in for a lot of stick for his arguments, but there is a recognition that he generated a lot of good information. I like Zuber's numbers because he provides the whole picture. You can see right and left wings, east and western fronts, Schlieffen's two plans and Moltke's plans. But as I say, there are other versions of these numbers on the internet, but they always have the same message, even if they don't have exactly the same numbers. Let's start at the start. I'm sure you'll have spotted it. If you look at the total number of divisions in the army between the three versions of the plan, Schlieffen's last plan, which was April 1905, the Great Memorandum about a year later, and then Moltke's in 1914, the big thing is that the Great Memorandum is using 33% more troops than he actually had at the time. These were all what are known as ersatz divisions, troops that you would effectively recruit on the day war broke out. The second thing to note, I've mentioned already, is the Schlieffen Plan is actually just a plan to attack France. So he's got an oversized army just attacking France. Now, that is significant, but we can see from Schlieffen's last plan in 1905, where he did two versions and he's just stuck 10 divisions over in Russia on the Russian front. He'd have probably, were the Great Memorandum to be used, put 10 divisions over in Russia. Moltke, as you can see, was very successful in getting the army to grow, but still not enough to meet the standards of the Great Memorandum. The thing on Moltke's, and we're going to come on to this a little bit more, is that the difference between the right wing in Schlieffen's last proper plan and Moltke's plan is that they're roughly the same. Actually, Moltke's was a bit smaller. I think Super's not quite right there. The trouble is most books compare the Great Memorandum with Moltke's figures, which is a bit like apples and pears. However, this is a bit of a minefield, and you will see other figures, not least because a division isn't a fighting unit as such. It has to be a corps, because that has all the bits. The problem that Schlieffen's big problem was that he essentially, and this was totally in keeping with Wilhelmine Germany, they did it all the time. They overrated their own strength. They were cocky, having had those victories. They thought they were masters of the universe, and the Schlieffen Plan thoroughly overrated his strength. This is a list of problems that von Kluck's First Army had on 4th of September 1914. If we think the BEF did pretty well to march 140 miles, I think, von Kluck's First Army marched 500 kilometers, which I think is about double what the BEF marched. As you can see, they had a huge number of casualties, not even through battle. They fought battles at Le Cateau and Mons. If you look at the Second Army's figures, which are pretty much the same, the Second Army was in the position that it could either reinforce itself or it could feed its existing army, but it couldn't do both. They hadn't got the logistics. And the Second Army had fought battles at Charleroi, Guise, and Liège. So essentially, Schlieffen's plan may have looked really good on the gaming table. It may have looked like Sadowa and Sedan, but in real life, he hadn't got the oomph to do it. Right, this is quite a complicated bit, so please do bear with me. It's lots of words on the screens, and that's always less satisfactory. There are three big things happening in and around 1904 to 1906. You've got the Russo-Japanese War, then becoming the First Russian Revolution. You've got the second thing, you've got the replacement of Schlieffen by Moltke at the beginning of 1906. And you've got this big dramatic change in the German war plans, whereby the right wing just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, the Moroccan crisis is interesting because it was between Germany on one hand and France and Britain on the other. And it was a concerted attempt by Holstein, who I've already mentioned, to break up the recently formed Entente Cordiale. Holstein knew there was a risk of war and was prepared to take that risk. Schlieffen, on the other hand, was actively willing to go to war. And the questions that emerge in all of that is, did Schlieffen lobby to attack France alone in a preventive war? Certainly looks like it. Was he looking to change the map of Europe? Was he sacked for it? Some people think so. And what was the actual purpose of the Great Memorandum, bearing in mind the numbers are at odds with what Germany had at the time? Well, this is kind of my best guess, and I freely admit that it's heavily reliant on Annie Mompower's biography of von Moltke, which is a book I can thoroughly recommend. Schlieffen was not ousted. His secretary, a guy called von Hanke, he was also his son-in-law, von Hanke claimed he was sacked. It wasn't. It was an orderly transition. Schlieffen was 72. He'd had a horse riding accident, and there was a query that if there was a war, he wouldn't have the physical or mental energy to manage it. Would he be physically up to it? Von Moltke was put in place in a candidate position in 1904, and he was then told at the beginning of 1905 that he was going to be the next holder of the job. It was all part of a process. The Kaiser has got a kind of bad reputation for being a bit of flippity-gibbet with appointments. He only had two chiefs of staff, two changes of chiefs of staff in his career. He only had 4 chancellors at a time when we had far more prime ministers. But this was an orderly transition. But there's no doubt that Schlieffen annoyed the Kaiser. He had a poor relationship with the Kaiser. They didn't get on at all. Schlieffen tended to didn't take part in politics, which the Kaiser liked, but he had very few charms. He was an absolutely typical grim Prussian officer. He lobbied the Kaiser, saying a war could be winnable and they could start straight away. The Kaiser wrote a very sharply worded letter back to him, saying, I will never do this. Obviously, he did in the end. Which leads you on then to the Great Memorandum. What was the purpose of this thing that clearly does appear to be not a proper plan? Well, Zuber's argument was that it was a complete outlier, that it was nothing to do with the plans that the Germans had on either side of it, and that it was effectively a campaign document, a document whereby Schlieffen showed just how many soldiers he needed, and therefore that's what the government should supply him with. The case is not a good one. The arguments against it, I think, are 2. One is that up until that point, Schlieffen had made very little effort to make the army any bigger. In general, the upper command of the German army didn't want the army to grow. They actually weren't all that much against the naval rise, because a growth in the army meant more of the socialist working classes amongst the troops and more of the middle classes amongst the officer class. So this was a sudden change in direction if it was a campaign document. My thought is pretty conservative, not original in any way. I think this is an attempt by Schlieffen, the Great Memorandum, is an attempt by Schlieffen to lock Moltke into Schlieffen's heritage. This is all about controlling his inheritance. Like many a senior person, and you just have to look at retired politicians, the world looks a lot simpler once you're no longer responsible for the job yourself, for the day-to-day management. And this is an attempt to keep Moltke in his grip, even though he's retired. And Schlieffen is quite prolific after he retires, clearly an attempt to maintain his strategic hold on the situation. Some of his famous quotes are cited as though he was in office, but were actually written when he was out of office. You know, when you march into France, let the last man on the right brush the channel with his sleeve. It was written in 1912 when he'd been out of office for 7 years. Before I'm going to take a drink, and it's a good one too. Right. The fall guy. The fall guy is undoubtedly the younger von Moltke. Schlieffen's sceptic and reluctant appointment. It's true that he was a slightly odd appointment. He'd not held the classic positions you hold before taking such a job. In particular, he'd never been chief of staff to a corps. He'd mainly been a courtier type soldier. He'd been adjutant to his uncle, he'd been adjutant to the Kaiser. He was slightly unusual for a Prussian military officer. He liked poetry. He carried Goethe's Faust around with him. He played the cello and he liked painting. But in all other respects, bar one, he was absolutely a typical Prussian officer. Nationalistic, xenophobic, deeply anti-Semitic. He was aware of his own inadequacies, and hence that quote at the top. He told the Kaiser he didn't want the job more than once, but the Kaiser insisted. The fact that he felt himself unable to do the job is used by the Schlieffen school as an argument to show that he was the wrong appointment, and it was obviously going to be a problem thereafter. But actually, Moltke was considerably better than Schlieffen at the key skill, arguably, for being chief of staff, which wasn't to be a strategist, but was to manage the Kaiser. He was much better than Schlieffen at managing the Kaiser, and he got on with him a lot better. And that relationship was pivotal in Wilhelmine Germany. So he was much better at getting money out of the Kaiser to grow the army. And even before taking the job, he insisted that the Kaiser abandoned his much beloved annual Kaiser maneuver. These were notionally war games that were rigged so that they always ended with a huge cavalry charge with the Kaiser at the head. And Moltke said, these are just not realistic. The soldiers on the defense are being told not to shoot at you, which surprised the Kaiser, and it's rigged so that you win, Your Majesty. And the Kaiser gave in like a lamb. He was very good at that. But he was also a profound critic of Schlieffen in several respects. He didn't think, his view was that the French were much more likely to attack than Schlieffen thought. And in 1906, his first war game, which had been prepared with Schlieffen, involved the French being on the offensive. He had a different view to the use of the right wing, which he saw much more as a flank guard, and he saw the attack as coming, the main battle as being in a different place. And we're going to come on to that now. This is Moltke's version. And as you can see, without a quick glance, it's a very different view. The first thing Moltke did was he re-evaluated Holland as somewhere to go through. The bit of Holland strictly they go through is that sort of bit that sticks out at the bottom. I think it's called Limburg. Moltke, in his soul of souls, maybe not even in his souls of souls, thought the war would last about 2 years. Certainly his plan was a pitch to win the war in a short period of time, but in his own mind, he thought it was going to last a long while. And in that time, he didn't want to have to fight 250,000 odd Dutch, nor defend the coastline against the British Navy once they'd defeated them. And it would have extended his front line even further. I think the German officers in the First World War had cause to thank Moltke for that decision. But of course, it had a profound impact on the rest of this huge army was assembled. That right wing is about, that first black line is about 600,000 men. Basically, once you take out the Dutch coastline, you have to bring the First Army in behind the Second Army, and they go in one behind the other, which is as those black lines intimate. The second thing that's happened is, as you work our way down this map, is that by 1910 to 1911, the Russians have recovered much quicker than people expected. By 1910-11, Moltke's estimate is that they will be able to close their mobilization period to about 2 or 3 weeks by 1915. So the expectation is it will be a two-front war. As a result from that, the French will definitely be attacking, and that changes things considerably. So, as he's crunched up all his troops, capturing Liège on the border is very important. The gap between the beginning of the Ardennes and the south of Holland at its narrowest is about 12-15 miles, and he's got to funnel these soldiers through. Liège wasn't that important to Schlieffen. It was about day 11, day 12, day 11. Moltke moves it in twice, and by 1914, Liège had to be captured by day 5 at the latest. To do that, he brought about what was Moltke's great addition to this, which was a coup de main, a blow of the hand on Liège, a surprise grab on Liège to be done within the first days. This creates a hair trigger. And the role of Liège in the war is not the fact that it delayed the Germans, but the need to capture Liège was a major cause of the war in 1914. He also knows that the French army is roughly the same size as his by the time you factor in all the reserves. The factor in the reserves you've got in total. Von Moltke takes quite a bold move then. He adds his reserves to the front line. What does this mean? Well, basically, the two armies, as I say, are roughly the same size, but neither army was using reserves in the front line. They didn't trust them, they were lower quality. Von Moltke needed to engineer some kind of numerical superiority. He also thought, with his bigger population, his reserves were of better quality, and he was correct, than the French ones were. What you do then is you make the reserves into a corps, and they have all the bits and bobs that go with the corps, and they're in the front line. This gave him a 1.2 to 1 advantage over the French, nowhere near the 3 to 1 that people see as the norm, as what he wanted. But the role of the right wing completely changes. It's not any longer something, it only plunges south if as a plan B, because he expects the big battle will be here. It'll be around Charleroi. It'll be on the Meuse somewhere, or on the Sambre, where the right wing will be actually as much a flank, and it will draw the French forward into attack, which is what it did. None of these talks is complete without a Churchill quote, and I think mine is, and I think it's Churchill, you know, the Germans lost the Battle of Charleroi, it just took them 4 years to realise it. Charleroi was a huge battle in 1914. The French lost 80,000 dead in 2.5 days. So that's kind of Somme level of attrition. First day of the Somme. So von Moltke's version has this much shorter arc to it because the French are on the offensive. They're not pinned back on Paris. What their expectation is they win some kind of big battle around the Meuse, and thereafter it's a pursuit. And in 1914, that's what they thought they were doing when they plunged south towards the Marne. They thought they'd won. Two enduring platitudes. When you see the three-part Schlieffen explanation, Schlieffen did a battle, Moltke changed it, Moltke messed up the actual event, two things appear. Firstly, two of the many, that Moltke weakens the right wing by reducing the ratio from 7 to 1 to 3 to 1. And secondly, that the issue that the plan required him to go around Paris. Let's start with the 7 to 1 to 3 to 1. I always think the 7 to 1, 3 to 1 looks like a radical change, but it's actually partly a visual thing, you know, 7 to 1 to 6 to 2. It's exactly the same thing, but it's then not quite as radical as transformation, a radical shift from the left to the right, or sorry, the right to the left. But it's also partly in the counting. Terence Holmes, who's done a lot of the work on Schlieffen since Zuber wrote his book, has pointed out there were 5 corps in reserve on the Schlieffen Plan, which were there specifically to prevent the French from reinforcing their left, the German right. You only get a 7 to 1 if you call those troops in reserve part of the right, when actually they could have easily just as easily been called part of the left. Secondly, Schlieffen had holes on the left. He had nothing in Alsace to speak of. I think he put Italians there because, you know, at that point Italians were promising troops. Schlieffen had holes to plug. Moltke had holes to plug. So as the army grew, he didn't necessarily shift them from right to left. As the army grew, the new stuff, by and large, went to the left. Also, he was arguing that the battle was not going to go that far right. It wasn't going to go to Dunkirk. It wasn't going to go to Paris. You don't need to go that far right if the battle is going to be around Charleroi. And also, what it assumed was that the logistic, also it assumed fantastic logistics. And it was pretty clear from an examination they did in the late 1900s that the roads out west just not would sustain an army on the move. So in the whole business about weakening it from 7-1 to 3-1 is a bit of a misnomer. The second one is that going west of Paris was central to the Schlieffen Plan. That's what Zuber argues. Zuber argues that it was all about taking Paris. It was actually what Terence Holmes calls a contingent feature. It was all dependent on where the French went. If the French were on the defensive, pinned to this sort of massive armed encampment, which is what Paris was, reluctantly, and in the fourth sort of drafting of the document, he realizes that he has to take troops around Paris. It's the only way he can get the room for maneuver to attack the flank. Supposing it had happened in 1914, supposing Von Kuhl had not turned in, had carried on going round Paris as the Schlieffen school said he should have done. Well, at that point, by the time Von Kuhl was heading round the edge of Paris, the French had an army on the northeast corner of Paris. It would have driven north and cut off Von Kuhl's supply line. The BEF, who were just south of Paris and east of it, would have just turned through 90 degrees to face Von Kuhl as he came round the corner. So going round Paris would have not been some universal cure. As we get closer to the war, you can see why the Germans were getting pretty antsy. I do wonder sometimes how the Russians or the French, or indeed the British, would have reacted were they in the strategic position that Germany was in. In 1912, the German ambassador in London is told by Haldane, the Secretary of State for War, that Britain will not allow France to be destroyed. So that Britain's war aims are not just about protecting the Belgian coast, it is about the survival of France. We now know that in 1908, Joffre, when he becomes, 1911, when he becomes Chief of Staff, commits France to the offensive. This is not a secret. The Germans have got their spies. It's also glaringly obvious that all the noises coming from Paris are that France are going to be on the offensive. To some extent, that is not deemed bad news by the Germans. But what is bad news is that in 1913, the French extend their period of conscription from 2 years to 3 years, which bumps up the size of the French army straight away. It's what drove Moltke to have to put reservists into the line. Italy are part of the dual alliance. Schlieffen had gaily put some Italian troops in Alsace, but in 1912, the Italians make it clear that no Italian troops will be sent to help Germany at all. The Balkan Wars. Much as people may dislike Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, the things what he brings home in that book absolutely clearly is the big change that was brought about in the European balance of power by the two Balkan Wars. Suddenly, Austria-Hungary had a very big neighbour on her southern, a very aggressively inclined neighbour, and Austria-Hungary had a new problem to deal with, and that would weaken the dual alliance. And finally, Russia recovers. In particular, better fortifications and better railways and a shortened mobilization time. You are in this ludicrous situation that the Germans have a strategy that has to be used by 1915, or else they have to think of a new one. Or perhaps that's what they should have done. Right, we're nearly there. The War Council took place on 8th December 1912. It usually has a capital W and a capital C, but actually it was they called it a War Council as a sort of sarcastically. This is immediately after the Germans have been told about what Britain's position is. As soon as the Kaiser gets a message, he calls together his army chums. And personally, I just see these grumpy soldiers and sailors sitting in leather armchairs, drinking brandy and just getting crosser and crosser about the state of the world. But there is the Fisher school of the history of the first origins of the First World War that argues that this is the start of the German path to war. At the meeting, and we've only got one record of the meeting, this is by Admiral Müller. Admiral Müller's record says that during the meeting, everybody was in favour of war. Moltke was in favour of war, Müller was in favour of war, the war minister was in favour of war. The only person who had a caveat was Tirpitz, who said he didn't want a war, he'd like a war, but not until June, July 1914, when the Kiel Canal was finished. What came out of that meeting were two or three things that were important, though. The soldiers came to the conclusion that the biggest obstacle to them getting a war that they were desperate for was the Kaiser, that the Kaiser may talk but would never act. They jokingly called him the Peace Kaiser. So von Moltke, having now at least got the money to build his army even bigger, first of all, does not tell them about Liège, keeps that completely secret. Bethmann Hollweg didn't know about it until the 31st of July 1914. But then he also abandons something called the Ostaufmarsch, which I haven't mentioned yet. This is essentially Moltke's old strategy of defending in the west and attacking in the east. The exact proportions are not exactly known. Some sources say it was effectively a war of annihilation against Russia in the event of it being a one-front war against Russia. Others say, oh no, it was actually more like Moltke's plans with a war, a defensive barrier in the west. Either way, Moltke goes away from this meeting and does a war game, a desk-based war game. And in that war game, Ostaufmarsch works out that it kind of breaks down and reaches a stalemate somewhere on the line between Vilnius and Kiev, largely because of logistical problems, which is sort of actually what happened to the Germans in 1915. At that point, von Moltke eliminates that as an alternative to the Schlieffen Plan. There is now only one plan on the desk. It involves a surprise grab on Liège, and the people doing the negotiating with the Russians and the French and the Austro-Hungarians don't know about the importance of Liège. So, as we tidy this up, as we've now reached July 1914, it's worth considering what sort of people Moltke and Schlieffen were. They really were just military technicians. Their duty was fulfilled if they did the utmost with the means that they had available. That it was a very narrow view of the world. It might be a traditional military view. Others may be able to advise me that. Moltke was very pessimistic about their chances, thought it was a real throw of the dice that it would succeed, but felt no higher responsibility at all to warn the Kaiser or the Chancellor that the chances of success were small compared with the risks, and that the German policy ought to be adjusted. Instead, he tried to make Schlieffen's plan work. He never told them that the politicians all laboured under the misapprehension that the German military might would see them to victory were it to come to that, when Moltke's view of it was much more pessimistic. He prepared for a worst case scenario, and then by eliminating the Ostaufmarsch, ensured that the worst case scenario happened. What he should have done is not pass the problem back to the civilian leadership and say, you need a deal with Russia to find your way out of this, and the Russians are eminently bribable. So you say, well, clearly that would have been impossible. Well, in the same time as this, Britain and France buried a century-long enmity, a near war for Schoda, and 6 years later signed up to the Entente Cordiale and became bosom buddies by 1914. So it was possible, but the Germans didn't try because the soldiers, in a way, wouldn't let them. So German strategy turned what could have been the Third Balkan War, which Germany would have won, into the First World War. That's the thing that makes it happen. Otherwise, it would have been an Eastern European conflict. There were two scenarios, had it not been for the existence of the Schlieffen Plan. It would have been a Russo-Austrian, German-Austrian war, which on the basis of what happened in the First World War, the Germans and the Austrians would have surely won, and probably within a much shorter time. Supposing the French had become involved, and that's debatable, although most opinion is that they would have become involved, the Germans were able to hold off the French and the British along a 400-mile front for the best part of 4 years. Had they instead attacked in the east and not in through Belgium, they would have been defending, a 200-mile front, just facing the French on the worst bit of frontage to attack on. So in the end, the Schlieffen Plan was a major cause of it becoming a world war. And you do come down to this issue of Liège, and Liège being a cause of the war. Once it became likely that there would be a war, the need to get into Liège meant that the war would start. And it didn't help that the Russians had got their own version of a hair trigger. They'd got, because of their need to mobilize in a shorter period of time in order to please their French allies, they'd committed in secret amongst themselves to a secret order going out, mobilizing in the case of a severe international incident that wasn't a full mobilization. The notices went out and the Germans interpreted that as a full mobilization and immediately triggered the invasion of Belgium. So you always do come back to this issue of this coup de main on Liège and the Schlieffen Plan, Moltke version of it, being essential cause for the war. Yes, they did box themselves in, but they did it on purpose. Okay, thank you very much. That's it. Thanks. And I hope
thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Ross. That was splendid. Thoroughly enjoyed that, as we do on these occasions. If anybody would like to raise their hands as a acknowledgement of the instead of the clapping, that would be brilliant. And we've got hundreds of hands being raised here, Ross, in the bottom corner of my screen. So thanks very much indeed for that, everybody. Thoroughly enjoyed that, Ross. Tremendous. It's now time for questions. So if you've enjoyed that and you're not a member of the Western Front Association, please do consider joining us. It's super value for money. You can join us via the WFA website. It's very good value for money, and you get lots of benefits. If you are a member, please go along to the WFA shop. You'll find a few things there. You might want to buy something instead of making a donation, because we're not making any charge here. So the question that we got early on, and for technical reasons I'll read this out rather than inviting Jim Hamilton to ask the question. Jim's question was, Corelli Barnett, in his 1963 book The Sword Bearers, claims that a decisive factor in the failure of the Schlieffen Plan was the failure of the German planners to exploit the dependence of the French on their railway network. He quotes, on September 6th, the Germans were within 30 miles of victory. He writes, i.e. Kluck's first army was within striking distance of Melun on the last lateral rail line from Paris to the French armies. Would you agree with Barnett's, Corelli Barnett's conclusion?
The answer is sort of kind of yes and no. Schlieffen didn't, it wasn't, you'll read in quite a few places that Schlieffen gaily used his own railways and sort of assumed the French wouldn't use theirs. But he, by and large, thought the French would be on the defensive and there anyway. So the railway issue doesn't apply so much to Schlieffen. It really applies to Moltke. Now, the messages were going back to Moltke almost straight away from all along the front. That's what was happening. Whole armies were disappearing from the east and being sent to the west. The troops at the front could actually hear the trains going backwards and forwards. The two main rail depots in the east were shipping about 100 trains a day from east to west to build up the forces. Two armies, the Lorraine army and the Alsace army, were completely reformed on the opposite side of the front. These messages were conveyed back to Moltke. He knew, and he told the soldiers at the front. And he told Von Kluck, and that this was happening. The villain of the piece is Von Kluck. He, in particular, decided he was the guy who turned inwards with everybody's agreement, admittedly, but he didn't leave a proper flank guard. The two corps, he sent two corps forward, the 3rd and the 9th, to chase the French, and they never succeeded, and then they had to be recalled. But on the other hand, did nothing to look out for any French build-up in the west. He did actually accidentally bump into part of the French build-up and defeated it in a skirmish on the Seine, but they retreated. If he'd actually done a proper job with his flank guard, he would have picked up the existence of Minuri's army, and he wouldn't have done acted in the way he did. When von Moltke on the 4th of September issued his new instructions, which actually completely ended the Schlieffen Plan, and asked von Kluck to point towards Paris and not to try and envelop the French, von Kluck was deeply annoyed about it all. But that was rather late in the day. By then, Minuri had already built up the 6th Army. So that's your answer.
Malcolm, if you'd care to unmute yourself. You're live now, Malcolm. Would you like to ask your question there?
Hi, Malcolm.
Yeah, hi, Ross. Thank you so much for a very, very excellent presentation on the Schlieffen Plan. Learned an awful lot about it, and thank you for the excellent professional presentation. I remember seeing a documentary program, perhaps read it somewhere, that the whole of the Schlieffen Plan was dependent on the German army capturing a Belgian rail junction.
That's Liège. That was
Liège, yeah. And
that's why they wanted Liège.
To do it on the day required.
Yes.
Is that actually true?
Yeah, well, that's exactly Liège. Basically, Ludendorff is the villain of the piece here. In fact, Ludendorff is probably the father of the dilution of the Schlieffen Plan. He became head of deployment in 1908, and the dilution of the plan started around then. He went on a holiday to Liège, funny. In fact, you know, there's so many generals on bikes and in cars around northwest France. I'm surprised Thomas Cook didn't do holiday trips for them. But anyway, Ludendorff went to Liège, and what he worked out correctly was that the guns that surrounded Liège didn't protect the town itself. You could get straight in, which he did in 1914, knocked on the door. But he wrongly assumed the guns would then surrender, which they didn't, and nor did he get the right caliber of gun to do it. But that was the big addition to the Schlieffen Plan that Moltke and Ludendorff did, was this smash and grab on Liège. Because they were coming through this narrow neck of land, they needed it as a transport hub to go thereafter. I obviously didn't make that clear. So Liège, Schlieffen didn't matter. It was day 12, it was just another place. But it became absolutely fundamental to Moltke's version of the plan. And it became a trigger for the war. So yes, that was the railway. It was the railway. Actually, the Belgians destroyed a lot of their railways anyway, so it was illusory.
Thank you for that.
Okay,
thanks very much. Thanks. Colin Harnett. Are you? Yeah,
Right.
go for it.
Good evening. Yes, thank you. Yes, a very interesting talk. Thanks very much. I'm interested in the British and French reactions, if there were any, to the Schlieffen Plan. So the question is, what did they know about the Schlieffen Plan, if anything? Given that they were doing a lot of their own planning in the years before the war, and lots of war games and scenarios which involved a German violation of Belgian neutrality, and where the forces, where if a BEF was involved, where they would be positioned. What did they know about the Schlieffen Plan? Or did they know? Or was there any information at all? And if they didn't know, did they make any attempt to find out what the Germans were planning to do throughout that period?
Well, they were pretty certain, 99% certain, they were going to come through Belgium, because they knew about the forts. They knew the forts were pretty difficult. It was pretty, I think, again, Churchill, I think, said some stage they're going to come through Belgium. What caught them by surprise, both the French and the British, that wasn't the problem. And in fact, you know, there's always a bit of a sort of theoretical debate that had they stuck with Schlieffen's first kind of idea, would the British have actually been drawn in? But what did catch them out was the extent to which they went west. They never expected them to go as far as Brussels or that far. They just thought it would be a much more narrow incursion. In 1906, William Robertson, then in intelligence section, did a desk war game, and he said, there's a paper in Little Heart military archives, you know, this is what's going to happen, and they're going to win. They will defeat the French if it's just Germans against French. So we knew they were coming, but we didn't know the extent to which it was going to go. The line, vertical line, is the Meuse River, which runs roughly north-south. The assumption was they'd stay east of the Meuse. Going west caught them out. So they all knew they were coming. So when French and Sir John French and Henry Wilson in 1914 said, well, we shall advance, initially anyway, they thought it was into open territory. And they were, you know, French was being told, oh, look, they're in Charleroi. He didn't really believe them. They thought they'd be further east. But they did think they'd come through Belgium. So it was a matter of degree. But for the Germans, the British really didn't matter. It mattered to the Kaiser, curiously, who was always in awe of the British. And obviously things naval appealed to the Kaiser. And that's why it was Ambassador Lichnowsky's message which kind of triggered the Kaiser's anxiety. But for Schlieffen and Moltke, it really didn't matter. It would be all over by the time the British got themselves across. They also thought they'd probably go to Dunkirk, or maybe further north from Dunkirk, and wouldn't go as far south as they eventually did, which was, you know, they went down to Boulogne. And so they expected if the British came, it would be too late. They'd have already beaten the French.
Okay. Thanks very much. Super. Peter Newham, I'm just unmuting you. Peter, you're live, if you care to ask your question.
Yeah, there's a lot written, I think, about the absence of effective lateral communications between the different German armies once the plan was in place, or once the plan was being operated. My question, though, is more about the role of Moltke as a war leader. To what extent would you say that the failure of the German plans in the West were essentially a failure of Moltke's nerve?
I'm going to take, there's actually three questions there, I think. I'm going to tackle the one you passed on because I think it's quite interesting. That is, the Germans took the decision that their main form of communication would not be telephone, it would be by radio. The trouble was they could only reach as far as the Third Army. So the First and Second Armies, their two most important armies, were effectively out of control for the whole of the war. That was why at the start, von Bülow, in charge of the Second Army, had a kind of coordinating role over those three armies. Von Moltke, there's two things. A, he wasn't up to it, yes. B, nobody would have been up to it because it was almost certainly doomed to fail. Thirdly, I think the other element is there was something, he was trying to fight the war like his great uncle did, and that the German way was that you brief the guys in charge of the armies, and they then, you don't lead them on a minute-by-minute basis. They're in charge. Whereas Joffre is micromanaging on the other side. He's, he's sacking people. One day he's in his car back to, along the front, leading and directing. Von Moltke thought he was doing it as he was supposed to, which is you brief the generals, you tell them what they've got to do. In particular, he told them, if the army alongside you calls for help, you should probably ignore it, stick to your objectives. He thought that was the way to do it. And all the messages he was getting back was, we're winning. That's the, right, when all those messages were coming back saying they're ferrying lots of troops from east to west, it clashed with all the messages he was getting from his commanders saying, we're winning. And I think it's Falkenhayn who says, but where are the prisoners? They mistook, what was an orderly retreat for a rout. It wasn't, it was an orderly retreat. As for Moltke himself, he was this strange, he believed in kind of the afterlife. He believed in something called theosophy. It's a guy called Rudolf Steiner, a kind of spiritualist thing, which is very weird to have if you're a soldier. And in fact, he was told by the Kaiser to stop dabbling in it. He was a sensitive soul. And also, he'd had a near stroke during the crisis, which I think you probably know about, judging by the way you're nodding your head, whereby when the Kaiser said, don't fight in the West, he had a mental collapse. So no, he wasn't up to it, but I suspect nobody was up to it. It just made it worse than it may have been, because it was essentially, there's something I forgot to say, which was, I will fish it out and find it very quickly. Yeah, I actually sort of glossed over it. When you look at the position von Kluck's army was in 1914, there is this axiom that an attacker's strength dwindles as a defender increases. And because of the sheer depth of the German penetration, it was very easy for Joffre to reverse an earlier decision and start adding reservists into the line, because his lines of communication were so much shorter than the Germans. Von Moltke, on the other hand, had got this fantasy of dreaming up 6 to 8 ersatz corps. Now, if you remember the start of All Quiet on the Western Front, the boys will rush off from school and join the army straight away. They were kind of the guys that made up the ersatz corps, and they could never have been trained inside 6 weeks to be part of the push down to the south. So there's all sorts of reasons why the thing failed before you ever get to the fact that Moltke wasn't up to it. Okay.
Okay, super. Thanks very much for that. Let me now turn to Jonathan Davey. Jonathan, I'm just unmuting you there. I'll ask you to unmute. There you go. You're live. Carry on.
Thank you very much. Take a well-deserved sip. Fascinating.
So, yeah.
My question is goes back to Liège, and it follows on earlier on about the importance of the railway networks. But the whole thing, given that Liège was so important, they knew it was so important, and it finally took them until they got the Austrian siege artillery up. Why wasn't that closer as part of the contingency plans if the coup de main didn't work?
I mean, it's, well, two things. Ludendorff's cock up, they knew that it was, I think it's three meters thick of oil, of soil, and 3 meters of metal plate protecting those forts. They knew from their tests of trying to get through the French that it would be difficult. It was just a grade A cock up. I think they got one from Krups before they got the one from Skoda. So the other thing is actually the impact of Liège on the outcome is overestimated. I have a suspicion, because we were fighting for the Brits, we were fighting for the Belgians, we've kind of bigged up the Belgians because we want to be a worthy cause. My favourite book on the subject, which is this little blighter on Marne, which is Hsuel Ting, book written in the 30s, does quite a good evaluation of what the impact of Liège was. And he reckons at the best, it was a delay of 48 hours, and at the worst, it was 72 hours. Because all the First and the Second Army were being built up in the background while Liège was going on. And so it wasn't as if those First and Second Armies were ready to pile through. They took, 84,000 horses had to be brought largely from Prussia. All of that stuff was going on. So although Liège cost them some time, it was, if they'd arrived to defeat the French on day 44 rather than day 42, I don't think they'd have been that unhappy about it. So I think Liège is overstated, bigged up as a thing. And I think it's partly to do with our need to feel that we're fighting for plucky Belgians, but that's purely personal. But according to Hsuel Ting, it didn't make a whole load of difference.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thanks for that. Right. Elaine, you've asked me not to put you on the video, so I'm just going to unmute you there. And if you want to speak, Elaine, you're now live.
Thanks, David. Thank you, Ross. Ross, you mentioned that the Schlieffen Plan was informed to some extent by a belief that an urbanized German population would not support a protracted war of entanglement. And that's my paraphrase of what I understood you to say. Yeah. Did you mean that would not tolerate or bear a protracted entanglement in a sort of moral sense, or that it would not be able to sustain it in an economic and military sense?
Economic predominantly. He thought the world was already, there were two reasons. There was a moral argument about class, which I'll come to, but let me just put it down so I remember it. It was economic. It's funny when we talk in a world of globalization in the 21st century, but at the end of the 19th century, Schlieffen thought the world was already too interconnected. He was a grim Prussian. This is the man who, when he went home to do bedtime stories from his daughters, did the military history. He was a grim Prussian of the rural tradition, and deeply suspicious of towns which were just full of socialists. Thought the urban working classes wouldn't have the mettle to take it, that they wouldn't be able to survive economically because too much trade was going on that would be disrupted. And so it's this combination of urbanization, weakening the moral fibre of your stout agricultural worker, who they thought made the best soldiers. They also feared that socialists in the army would weaken the fighting calibre of the German army. So there was a combination of moral weakness coming from being urban rather than stout yeomen, combined with the fact that too much trade already made Germany not self-sufficient.
Right, thanks very much. Thanks for your question, Elaine.
Thank you.
Glenn.
Ross, building on the question before about Liège and the effect it had on the German invasion, from the technical fortification side, which I've studied a couple of times in the past, Liège was never really rated as a strong fortress. A couple of reasons for that. First of all, the physical structures were not as strong as, say, Verdun, which had been modernized at the turn of the century. And secondly, the designer Briomont, he'd sited the forts equidistant from each other. He didn't take the ground into account. There was no depth to the system, and there were no intermediate fortifications like the French employed at Verdun, for example. But you seem to be suggesting that actually just its physical being had an effect on the on the German plan, although, as you said towards the end of the last question, it only delayed them for 48 hours.
Yeah, I mean, this talk is largely up until July 14, but all the questions are post July 14, which, so I'm having to sort of slightly delve into the memory banks. You actually know more about this than I do, is the first thing. My understanding, I'm repeating myself, my understanding is that it was about their arc of fire, that their arc of fire wasn't interlocking well enough. So that's why they weren't very good. And I mean, that's, you know, that's pretty much the extent of what I know about it, without having to go back and look at my notes, to be honest with you. So, I mean, Liège was fun, you know, I'm repeating myself. It was fundamentally important because of its travel arrangements, and they thought they could capture it very quickly because they thought those, the guns were not as well defended. It was, you know, as you said yourself, the armor wasn't as, they thought the armor was thinner than it actually turned out to be, and they had to get a gun from Skoda. I can't help you any further. As I say, I think you know more than I do.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for your question, Glyn. We've got two very similar questions. So I'm going to still invite Gordon and Ralph and Elizabeth to ask their questions. Go for Gordon first. So let me just do this with Gordon. There we go. If you'd care to unmute yourself, Gordon, and ask your question.
A logistics question, really. Did the German High Command underestimate the Belgian army? How did it affect the German advance?
Cutting out.
Okay. Gordon's question is, did the German High Command underestimate the Belgian army, and how did this affect the flow of the German advance through Belgium?
Yeah, yes, they did underestimate it, and there's an argument from at least one major historian that actually it was the delay of the Belgian army after Liège rather than Liège itself which caused the problem. My argument has always been the same, that actually if it held them up a couple of days, it was neither here nor there. The major problem was that over a period of time, from the start to the finish, they just lost men continually. So Frederick Morris, in his book on it, says that the only thing that kept the soldiers going was the thought that they may get the chance to sack Paris. And when they turned inwards, they got really pissed off because it meant they weren't going to get the chance to sack Paris. Because they were, you know, Morris was at the time a divisional chief of staff, and they were picking up, you know, prisoners, and they were interrogating prisoners. So my view is generally not so much about the Belgians, but it was just a general decline over time of marching 500 kilometers. And this is kind of where Schlieffen got it all wrong, because, you know, it's all horses. It's all, you know, I listed all those figures on the slide. So yeah, the Belgians contributed, but it was all part of the peace. The Second Army fought 3 battles even before they got to the Marne. You know, they'd had it. The other thing that started happening with the wastage wasn't just the wastage on the men, it was the wastage on the leaders. If you look at what happened to the leadership of the German army, they're all ill and sick. You know, von Bülow's just about had it. His number 2's just about had it. Von Hausen, the Saxon commander next door, he's out of it and has to be replaced. You know, they're in a terrible, the sheer fatigue of this 500-kilometer march. So I don't single out the Belgians. It's just part of a piece that 500 kilometers, to expect to march 500, and they needed to win at Charleroi. The key thing was Charleroi, and they made a big mistake. Well, did they make a mistake? Maybe it'd been inevitable. This is a battle over 3 days. It's humongous casualties. Lonrezac, the French commander, is a little bit indeterminate. But when he decides to make the decision to retreat, he heads slightly sort of east of south. He could have been collared, because to the French army's right, the German Third Army has gone down the side of the Meuse River, and is going to, some of it is going to cross at a place called Givet. Had it done so, it would have come up behind Lonrezac's retreating Fifth Army and collared it, or at least certainly held it up while the Second Army caught up with it. Bülow was a bit of a, if anything went slightly wrong, he was always calling for help. And he was briefly delayed. And so he insisted, as he was the senior commander and the Prussian, he insisted on von Hausen supporting him. So von Hausen pulled back that advance guard from Givet, and they came and helped. They crossed at Dinant and tackled, but it enabled the Fifth Army to escape. Had the Fifth Army been collared just south of Scholwa, then that would have changed the equation completely, because then the Germans would have had the chance to work their way along the front. Scholwa is the big battle.
Okay, thanks for that, Ross. It's now 9:30, so I'm just going to do one more question from Ralph. Now, the thing is, it's probably my fault, but Ralph's question is very similar to Gordon's, and I suspect you might actually have largely covered a lot of it, but there is some subtle differences. So I'm just going to ask Ralph to unmute himself there. Ralph, you're live. Ask your question. Fire away.
Oh, thank you. An excellent talk, especially on this side of the Atlantic. We don't get too much of that over here. My question is, or my observation is that I saw that they believe that the French would be on the defensive at some points. They would be on the offensive at some points. There's a difference in the German leadership's thought of what the French might do. Did they actually underestimate the French abilities? Because I have seen in the past in my research where even territorial units in the French army were able to stop guard divisions and guard regiment in the attack.
They did underestimate the French. I mean, this is a slightly digression, but it's worth putting in. There was it, because you've mentioned reserves. The Germans put the reserves in the line, and Joffre's predecessor had lost his job because he suggested putting the reserves in the front line. French reserves were very low caliber, they thought, but because they got a smaller population, they had to use them. I just thought that might be of interest generally to the audience. By and large, this was an orderly retreat. The French had got very naive tactics going forward, as you probably know, this offensive at outrance, but in defense, they were very, very, very good indeed. They held them up all the time. Part of the problem was the messaging that was getting back to Moltke. The commanders were saying, we're zooming ahead. I'm not sure I can add much more to what I answered the other chaps. So maybe you've got time for one more question, I'm afraid, David. I mean, the answer to your question is yes, they did hold them up. They held them up quite nicely. An example of that is over in the East, where there is this funny issue of what do you do with the left wing of the German army. This is the Bavarian Sixth Army. And according to the plan, they've got a rotten job. While everybody else is marching and getting victories, their job is to stand still, or if anything, go backwards. And they don't particularly want to do that. They get a couple of smashing victories at places called Saarburg and Morhange. And then, of course, the pressure is, we want to go forward. And there is still a huge dispute who caused this. Was it the soldiers, the officers at the front? Was it the commander, Ruprecht, or was it von Moltke who allowed this? But as soon as the Germans went on to the offensive, they just got held up by the French straight away. And what you're getting, in fact, the first trench warfare happens well before the Battle of the Marne. The Eastern Front is into a trench warfare situation with the French defending against the advancing Germany. It's just outside Nancy, on the plain of Nancy, and they hold them up quite easily. And that's even before the Battle of Marne has started. I don't think I can say much more. I don't think I really know the answer to your question.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question, Ralph. Okay, on the basis that you said that you'd take one last question, I'm going to ask Alan Leakey to ask his question, and that will be the last question. So apologies to others who have asked questions. Alan, just unmute yourself there. Right, you're live. Last question, Alan. Go for it.
Okay. Given the significance of the right flank, why?
Lost you.
Oh, we've lost him. Okay, Alan's question was this. Given the overall weight of the German army on the right flank, why do you think Moltke failed to concentrate the German cavalry poor as it was on the right?
He had a low opinion of cavalry. Is the answer? But that's my understanding. He basically the role of cavalry. Moltke was had a huge success in modernising the Germany. All those arguments that took place about tactics were by and large resolved in favour of the modernisation. And part of that was that cavalry got quite relegated in the importance of the activity. So instead he put them purely, their main job was they were mounted infantry, or they were essentially looking for the edges. I'm losing my words here for a second. They were doing reconnaissance, but he didn't have a high opinion of it as a factor in the game. He was much more into the guns and the heavy guns in particular. So there was undoubtedly a failure on von Kluck's part, not necessarily Moltke's part, on von Kluck's part to use his cavalry to reconnoitre his right flank. That he was definitely negligent on. Okay, I think that's it.
Right, that's it. So, in final summing up, Ross, thank you very much indeed for your time tonight. It's been a really interesting, entertaining and informative presentation, and I'm very grateful indeed. I'm sure that WFA members have thoroughly enjoyed that. In answer to a few questions, this will go live on the WFA, not live, this will be recorded on the WFA's YouTube channel in a few days' time, but will remain on Facebook for the moment. So, Ross, very many thanks indeed for all your work tonight.
Thank you. I enjoyed that.
Good. Thank you very much. And I'll just play a tune as we go out. Thanks very much.
Mademoiselle from Armentières Park.